so I thought when we were listening to Tim talk last week about Rosaria Butterfield's, her book is like where it landed. And what I thought was, let's do some background. Let's figure out where this actually came from. So the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. Has anybody read this book? And I'm going to try to eat this one in 1 hour or less. And so hopefully it's meaty, it's weighty. 400 pages of a lot of philosophy. So I thought a good way to start would be to open up with some scripture verses. And like a good Presbyterian, we're constantly reforming our own faith. As a result, New Living Translation. So let's just kind of start reading through Psalm 73. Truly, God is good to Israel, to those whose hearts are pure. But as for me, I almost lost my footing. My feet were slipping, and I was almost gone. For I envied the proud when I saw them prosper, despite their wickedness. They seem to live such painless lives. Their bodies are so healthy and strong. They don't have trouble like other people. They're not plagued with problems like everyone else. They wear pride like a jeweled necklace and clothe themselves with cruelty. These fat cats have everything their hearts could ever wish for. They scoff and speak only evil. In their pride, they seek to crush others. They boast against the very heavens, and their words strut throughout the earth. And so the people are dismayed and confused, drinking in all their words. What does God know, they ask? Does the Most High even know what's happening? Look at these wicked people enjoying a life of ease while their riches multiply. Did I keep my heart pure for nothing? Did I keep myself innocent for no reason? I get nothing but trouble all day long. Every morning brings me pain. If I had really spoken this way to others, I would have been a traitor to your people. So I tried to understand why the wicked prosper. But what a difficult task it is. Then I went into your sanctuary, O God, and I finally understood the destiny of the wicked. Truly, you put them on a slippery path and send them sliding over the cliff to destruction. In an instant, they are destroyed, completely swept away by terrors. When you arise, O Lord, you will laugh at their silly ideas, as a person laughs at dreams in the morning. Then I realized that my heart was bitter, and I was all torn up inside. I was so foolish and ignorant. I must have seemed like a senseless animal to you, yet I still belong to you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, leading me to a glorious destiny. Whom have I in heaven but you? I desire you more than anything on earth. My health may fail and my spirit may grow weak, but God remains the strength of my heart. He is mine forever. Those who desert him will perish, for you destroy those who abandon you. But as for me, how good it is to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my shelter, and I will tell everyone about the wonderful things you do. The word of the Lord. So I first heard of the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, through the Colson Center when they were pushing it a couple of years ago. They were saying this is like the book of the year, if not the book of the decade. And that's where it came on my radar. And I didn't realize exactly what they were recommending, but they were saying that it gave words and language to what we're facing today, and it helps us understand. And so I thought that would be a nice starting point for, or like a background to what Tim was talking about last week. And so Carl Trueman, just a word of, he wrote the book. So he's a professor at Grove City College, but I also got to know him through the podcast that he puts out every week called The Mortification of Spin, which is a fun title, if nothing else. But the title of this book, too, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, it kind of reminds me a little bit of that meme where it's like, we'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs. It's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek, but it's also the book that this is based off from is a philosopher that I didn't know about at all before this. So Philip Brief, had anybody heard of this guy before me? I had not. So he put out a book in 1966 called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, where he was explaining a lot of where we are at now, but in 1966, which kind of reminds me a little bit of C.S. Lewis back in 1943, who did the same thing with the abolition of man. And so I was like, okay, so some people are connecting dots here along the way. And what Trueman is doing in this book is he's pulling it together from a philosophical but also a historical perspective. And so I think it's important that we actually look at the philosophy, and because in that we understand. So, being a counselor as I am, how we talk to ourselves, how we talk about things, changes how we act. Yes, sir?
Could you move your podium that
Yes.
way a little bit, and then it wouldn't block it?
Oh, thank you. Excellent. Yeah, can do. Yeah, I wasn't sure where I'm not looking at that. I wasn't sure where the cord would land. Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so the idea of the philosophy is that it gives us words and it gives us language, but it also gives us understanding. And that's one of the criticisms of the book, is it's too heavy on actual philosophy and not enough on pragmatic. And I think that's kind of where the hand in glove with what Tim was talking about last week is that that's more the pragmatic and this is more the understanding. And my hope is that actually as we talk about this, we land at certain words or phrases that are helpful as we kind of talk about what we're dealing with as far as our culture goes. So we need to understand philosophy just like we need to understand logical fallacies, because it takes what is overwhelming and it places us into the understandable. It's like, okay, we can put our arms around it. So if we can understand what the logical fallacies are, we can understand what the philosophy is behind it, we can actually speak intelligently about it. Otherwise, what happens is we tend to get overwhelmed. And if we just get overwhelmed, we get anxious, we don't know how to talk, and we just kind of get simplistic. And so that's what this dives into, but that is one of the criticisms of it. Philosophy, I came to understand, I didn't really know this beforehand, was all about instilling virtue. So the idea of old school philosophy, Aristotle in those ages, where virtue is knowable, goodness is objective outside of ourselves, beauty can be taught, and that was the nature of philosophy. Is let's teach, let's recognize what is good, what is virtuous, what is beautiful. And that is not something that is intrinsic. And so it's not in ourselves, it is outside of ourselves, and our job is to recognize it. And C.S. Lewis goes into this much more when he actually just describing general revelation. When he's talking about general revelation, he uses the term Tao. And he's saying that he uses that Chinese term. Says general revelation is knowable to all people. It is throughout cultures and times, and we have an ability to understand it. This is part of God speaking into us. Our job is to recognize it and to learn it. And so I want you to see that the philosophy side of things is worthwhile. So the impetus for this book was Truman and Rod Dreher were friends, and still are, I guess. He wrote the book Live Not by Lies, that I think is a little bit more common, but I don't know. But the two of them were talking and said, we got to take Philip Reef and make him accessible, because the way he writes is hard to understand. And so they got together and they said, okay, let's make him understandable. So a lot of the terms that are in this book are Reef's terms. And so he's unpacking it all. We didn't get here out of a vacuum. Reef died not too long ago, actually. He was around here. What I found was interesting about him is he wrote a book in 2006 where he's describing his grandfather, who was in a Nazi concentration camp. And his grandfather said that he thought that Hitler won because of how it changed Western world. And that the way that Hitler's perspective was that it changed our thinking. It moved us from one way of operating to another entirely. And he was like, that was the win. And of course, I haven't heard that anywhere else. But as a Jew, Reef put that out there. I think that work, the name of that book was like something, My Life Among the Death Works, which I have not read. Charles Taylor is not the Charles Taylor out of Africa, who's the revolutionary. He's a Canadian philosopher, and a lot of the terms here are from him as well. And so one of the main terms is the social imaginary. And if there's any terms that we kind of get out of today, that's, I think, a term that I want to highlight. And Alistair McIntyre, he knew, just kind of like Lewis was seeing things ahead of time, just like Reef was seeing things ahead of time. McIntyre was also, but he was not coming from a Christian perspective by any stretch of the imagination. Another word that I think we all need to know is teleology. That sounds fancy. Do we all know that word? All right, so I love this word. I've come to love this word. Teleology. Do you want to explain it?
From the Greek telos, which is the end or objective which you're after. So teleology is a philosophy based upon the desired outcome or objective.
Yep. So we can know the design based upon the results that it is. And my favorite piece here is that Jesus himself explained it. Wisdom is known to be right by its actions. That might be a New Living Translation. I think the ESV says something about by her children. But we know what is wise based upon the results of it. This is not the ends justify the means, not by any stretch. This is we know what the original purpose was in how it shows itself in the end. So teleology is a huge piece of how we come to know things, and that's in Matthew 11, just in case you wanted to know, where Jesus spoke that. But so to begin with, this book was saying, okay, if we are, the idea, the subtitle, by the way, is Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. So he unpacks all of these terms. So the idea of expressive individualism says, okay, we have reimagined ourselves as people. So it used to be when we could tell, the teleology of who we are as people. Why are we as human beings? We have shifted from saying, okay, we are going to know God and glorify him. We have been created for that purpose. Now we have shifted away from that along the way. And the term there is, so we have to understand how the self got redefined. And so how the self got redefined, here's these couple phrases, mimesis, and I'm going to pronounce it poesis. So poetical is where the poesis sounds from. And mimesis, I don't know if that's the same word as where the memes land or where they come. But mimetic is we can tell externally. There is an external order to things. There is an external value to things. There is an external purpose to things. It is outside of ourselves. Our job is to recognize it. Poetic, or that approach, is that our job is to read the purpose into it. We're supposed to imagine our way in. And that is a big shift. So if you kind of think of where we're at with gender assigned at birth versus gender recognized at birth, that's the difference between mimetic and poetic. And so one is it's recognized, and the other is that we are designing it ourselves. So one is it's outside of us, mimetic is, and the other is that it's inside of us. And so I think that's an important terminology also. So this piece right here is saying, how did we actually get to that point? So back in the early stages of the philosophy, a man at his height, a good man, a man who was achieving what needed to be done, was called the political man, or at least Charles Taylor is referring to him as the political man. So the political man is one who is involved with their community. They're involved with what's going on around them. They're external. Their social side of things. And that was compared to the idiotic man, which I thought was kind of funny, because idiotic man meant somebody who's all to himself. It was not meant as in unintelligent. It was meant as you have somebody who's involved versus somebody who stays away. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But that was the height of a man round about Aristotle's time. Then you kind of shift forward a few hundred years, and you get into the religious man, where you have culture being all around the church. So when the church bells rang, when the calendar was what it was, so everything was a church-related activity. So kind of think medieval times. And so you move from political as the height of what a man was, to a religious to the height of what a man was. And then you move to an economic. So are they providing for their family? Are they bringing in money? Are they taking care of the poor? So all of those three things, whether it be political or religious or economic, the height of what a person was based upon external. What are they giving? How do they impact the community? How do they take care of their family? And then you move into the psychological man, which is internal, which is how do I feel about things? And so at this point, the idea of who we are and how we are is based upon, do I have a sense of value? Do I have a sense of purpose? Do I feel it? And so that shift happened in right about the 1960s is how Truman identified that. And so he also refers to that as expressive individualism. So when you look at the terminology and the definitions, expressive individualism is the psychological man, where you turn from the outside inward. And that reminds me a little bit of Luther, where the curve, I can't remember. Yeah, that. And so you move outward and then you move inward. And that took a couple thousand years when you have that. But the term expressive individualism is that shift. So that shift happens more so with what's called the analytic attitude. So the analytic attitude is where you have other people playing into that. So it's like, okay, if I have my sense of self is just my sense of self, but you don't buy into that, then I'm on my own. But okay, now we're all taking care of me, that shifts things. So the analytic attitude is where the culture wide says, okay, we are now going to respond to how you feel, and we're going to take care of how you feel as well. And so the culture, its institutions and its practices, all of that fits into that therapeutic mentality, which is where the therapeutic society comes in. And that is the shift from what is good is now bad, what is bad is now good. Everything moves. The idea of the culture-wide shift, so we have the definition of a person is now changed, and then the idea of the culture is now changed with this analytic attitude. And so, but here's the thing that Charles Taylor kind of put together, was that it only one is a self only among other selves. I am only an individual if I am recognized by other individuals. So that reminds me a little bit of love. That C.S. Lewis was kind of saying it. Love is like only good if you're receiving it and sharing it with another person. Same with like humor, the idea that it's only complete if we're actually sharing it with other people. But now we've had a shift away from external to internal. Now the culture-wide is doing this, and also I am now got to be part of this. So it's a very social perspective that comes together. And so that develops the therapeutic society. So this is actually kind of interesting when you think of like a therapeutic society, because now what we have is unstable once we move into that. But how did it get to the unstable part is where he was actually looking into. And what they were describing was that to begin with, it was very pagan cultures, where you have myth, where you have fate. And it is also outside of us, but we're trying to manage myth and fate. Then you move into a religious, where you have faith, and you have order, and God is knowable and good. And so you move from a first world value system, not a first world economic, but a value system, into a second world value system. So the second world value system is that Christian or that religious society. And now both of those are very, very stable because what's helping us, what's moving us, what's our purpose is outside of us. And so, but the third world value system, where it's inside of us and we're trying to take care of other people's feelings, and we've got this sense it's unstable now, and it's very untenable. And so when you kind of think of like the LGBTQ side of things, it's like infighting at every point because we've got to make everybody happy. And yet we've got to maintain a certain sense of who we are if we're in that spectrum and where it all fits together. And so this is where, over the course of, long time, hundreds of years, we've moved from the first world value system to a second world value system, both of which very, very stable, and a third world value system, which is very, very unstable. And the thought here is Rome, and how did it fall? And of course, we all have to think that sometimes, right? But that's where it's like, okay, that comes together with that. Then enters Alistair McIntyre, McIntyre was a Marxist, full-on Marxist, and then the Cold War ended, and Marxism lost, and so he was left kind of like licking his wounds, saying, okay, how do we make sense of this? And so what his side of things was, okay, I'm going to go back to Aristotle. So you have a basic teleology, you have a basic understanding that God is outside of ourselves and the purpose of man and where that fits. And then he says, I don't like God. And so he came to this idea that what is the purpose of man if we take God out of it? And he came up with the term emotivism. So emotivism, and then he later shifted that into expressivism. So its preferences become truth claims. And this is when that shift really started to take place in our modern culture, was when preferences became truth claims. And of course, that makes me think of my truth. And when did we first hear that? When was that? Oprah? Okay. But in that shift, there is, you move from an you move from a culture into an anti-culture, and that's part of that analytic attitude, which also reminds people of Nietzsche, which was all about, I can't remember his term, transvaluation of values. Basically, everything turns upside down because it's catching on. So we had a shift from mimesis to poiesis. We've had a shift from second world values to third world values. We've had a shift from the external man to the internal man. We've had a shift from the transcendent frame. Oh, I didn't talk about the immanent frame. So the immanent frame is the therapeutic social culture. So the immanent frame is the social culture that is therapeutic in nature because it's all about our inside. Everybody's kind of taking care of other people's feelings. And that's what's referred to as the immanent frame. And then you have the shift from a culture into an anti-culture. And then we have a shift from prohibitions, because we know what society, this is Freud, but we're about to get to that, is that a culture is defined by what it prohibits, is Freud's thought. And so what a culture prohibits is what defines it. And so the shift is from having prohibitions to having none. And so that sounds depressing, but we have Christ, and that shifts everything. He's in charge of all of this. I did not know Rousseau at all until I read this book. Does anybody know Rousseau? He wrote an anti-Augustinian Confessions. I had no idea. He wrote a book called Confessions, and that was basically the anti-Augustine. And I'm like, I did not know that. And his whole focus was on the self. And this was back in what, the late 1700s? And so this has been brewing. So when we talk about, okay, this is where we're at since the 1960s, where were we at before that? And Rousseau set the stage for this. And it wasn't just Rousseau. It was the fact that around Rousseau, there were poetics, the arts. And so we moved from, the romantic, we have Wordsworth, Shelley, and Blake, but lots of other romantic poets. But the idea that his ideas became popularized through art. And so that was huge. It's like we wouldn't have Rousseau so much if he wasn't able to have a group of artists come after him that shifted things among the culture. So art moves people. We know this. And if art is beautiful and what it is and recognized as that, then it moves people. And if what they're espousing is very anti-Christian, then it moves people also. And so then you have then the Nietzsche and Marx, and we'll get to that in a little bit here. But the idea of that the innate innocence of, so basically one of the things that Rousseau was put out there was that people are born good, none of that sinful nature side of things. How are they corrupted? It's culture, it's adults, and so therefore people are good as young, but not as older. And so then you have this cult of youth that kind of comes out of that. And Freud builds on that. So Shelley, he was full on. He said, in fact, religion and morality as they now stand compose a practical code of misery and servitude. And so this was the poetry that he put out there, was along those lines. And so he connected, Nietzsche came along just a little bit after all of this. So these guys were like contemporaries, but they were not really, they didn't really know each other as I understand it. But Nietzsche came on afterwards, and of course his piece was self-creation. He was all about that, dismantling the nuclear family and dismantling right and wrong. And so this was kind of where all those other artists came along, and they built on that. Marx also built on that. Actually, Marx was just a little bit before him, but they were kind of connected. But one thing I didn't know about Marx is that he's like the author of modern-day feminism, and I had no idea that was the case. So he's actually saying, the less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. And I'm like, wow. And I knew that, the whole idea of him saying, okay, we don't want to trust our employers, we don't want to trust the people who have authority over us. I knew that, but I did not know the feminism side fit right into that. Darwin was not the first person to identify the whole concept of evolution. There were lots of people that came before him. What made Darwin actually impressive, according to what I was reading here, is that Darwin was about removing teleology. He was about removing the purpose of man. So the other pieces had evolution kind of like as God working. Darwin had evolution as natural selection. And so his whole piece was, let's remove the purpose of man from God and disconnect him. And that's where he actually kind of came in. And so when you look at the shift, it was probably Darwin that had the biggest influence in that regard. Marx too, but here's a fun term that I like, Sittlichkeit. It's a German word, but the Sittlichkeit is I'm going to give an example into it just a little bit here, but it's the recognition and conformity reinforce each other. If I'm going to be recognized by other people, I need to conform to the other people. And then what they're about, I need to be about also. And so one reinforces the other, my recognition and conformity. So it kind of builds on itself. We can kind of watch this in action in just a little bit. These are also, so the sexual revolution is really an identity revolution in who we are as far as shifting people and our view of self. But the idea there was removing shame, removing guilt, and saying who we are is individual. And that's really the more piece about that. First and foremost, Freud is garbage. As a therapist, let me just kind of throw that out there. He's an excellent marketer and a lousy therapist. And so everything about him has been proven wrong across the board. There's nothing that he has said that has been accurate. But that doesn't change the fact that his thoughts shifted culture. His whole piece was if happiness is the desired goal of all human beings, then, for Freud, the pleasure principle, the quest for pleasure focused on sexual gratification, it is central to what it means to be a self. And so it's built on Rousseau's piece that says, okay, children are basically good, it's society that corrupts them. Then you take Freud and you throw in, well, okay, it's all about pleasure. And then what you have intrinsically, not overtly, but kind of as a matter of it, is the sexualization of children. And so this is where a lot of today's issues kind of play out in that regard and saying, okay, children can assume their own gender kind of stuff. So Freud sees morality as fundamentally irrational and ultimately subjective, which is all about feelings, which reminds me of Lewis and the Abolition of Man, and we have no chest. So then Wilhelm Reich comes along, and he brought Marx and Freud together. Marx and Freud were not natural friends. Their ideas were totally different. But Marx with the distrust of your employer and the people in charge and authority, and Freud being the whole idea of pleasure, that's saying, okay, that's not a natural connection. And so that's when we have, no longer is the claim made that gay people can fit into American society, that they are as decent, as patriotic, as clean living as anyone. Rather, it is argued, it is the American society itself that needs to change. And so this was 68, I think, was when that was said. So victimhood became the key to the key virtue that was identified there. And so that was about that point, and then it kind of built on it from there. What I didn't remember, but I was reminded of, is that on the LGBT side of things, L and G were not aligned. They were like opposed to each other. And I had totally forgotten this, I think just with the course of the last few years. But the lesbian side of things was like opposed to the gay side of things because they saw what as uniquely female, that their problems that they were doing had its own uniquely female issues that they were fighting, whereas the gay side didn't have that fight. And so they saw that as a dichotomy, and they were not aligned at all until the 80s when AIDS came along, and then it was that victimhood being the key piece. That aligned them. And so now they have a common enemy in the nuclear family, in sexual mores, in godly living. And so their enemy, they were able to unite under that virtue of victimhood. And then everything else kind of comes along afterwards. I'm skipping a few things, so if I'm not tracking, let me know. I'm recognizing I have a whole lot here. So it's that virtuous victimhood side of things. And so the transgenderism was always a struggle for that piece. And so for transgenderism to be coherent, the society in which it occurs needs to place a decisive priority on the psychological over the physical in determining identity. And so that goes back to the expressive individualist, but the whole therapeutic society as it's connected. And so post-World War II, or post-World War I, technology has assumed a key role in the more radical context of making, where am I? Okay, there we go. Technology has assumed a key role in the more radical context of making plausible the separation of biological sex and the concept of gender. But regarding art, most people have not read Freud, but many people find appealing the message preached in a myriad movies and television shows that life is about finding individual sexual satisfaction and that one's sexual appetites lie at the very center of who one actually is. So even though we haven't read all of these people, and really who has, the themes are embedded. And that's kind of coming back why the terms are important and why the language is important that we're able to see, where art plays a piece into that. And so that's kind of where we want to look at is we are in these waters. We swim in these waters. A therapeutic society, we use the language of expressive individualism, and we are operating from that context ourselves. So what does that mean about us and how we speak? What does that mean about us and how we interact with the world? What does that mean about us when we use the language that we use? And so when it comes to how we think of ourselves, we are all expressive individualists now. And there's no way we can escape from this fact. Acknowledging this reality is an important foundation for addressing those symptoms of this present age that we find to be more egregious. And that's Carl Trueman's conclusion. And I thought that was a pretty appropriate one. It's like, okay, this is who we are, where we are. God put us in this time and place. And so now this is our struggle that we've got. We've got this history that didn't come out of nowhere. And so we can speak into this, hopefully, more intelligently by having read the book. And so where are the elite thinkers in Christianity today? Because that's like the Rousseau. Where are the artists, the Christian artists today? Because that's kind of like what moves the populace. Where does men without chests fit in? Where does a collective repentance fit in? And I thought I would end with New Living Translation. And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Remember, these are all outside of ourselves if we have a teleology. Keep putting into practice all you have learned and received from me. Everything you heard from me and saw me doing, then the God of peace will be with you. And yeah, I skipped over a lot. I hope the train of thought was there. And so just some companion reading. Vadi Bakkum's got a nice little new book out that I have not read, but it's popped up on my reading list. How it's not like being black. And I think there's probably some of that same history in there. But shall we close in prayer? Father, you are good to us, and you have placed us in this time and situation, and we know that you are here and close, and we ask for more of you and less of ourselves as we lean into the world that you've put us in. Help us to lean into your Spirit, and it's by your strength and grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah.
The book is a very dense book. I read it.
It is.
But my understanding is that Carl Trueman wrote a cut-down version of this book.
I heard that too. I haven't seen it.
Okay, I was just wondering whether it is.
Strange New World.
Okay.
It's called Strange New World.
Okay.
And it is a popularized version of Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Okay, yeah.
It was a little bit more pragmatic.
Yeah, and this is less pragmatic.
Yeah, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self has a lot of philosophical history in it. It is worth reading to understand kind of how we ended up where we're at. But Strange New World is a little bit easier, is a little bit more accessible.
Probably a play on Brave New World.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Other thoughts?
Chris,
Yeah.
on May 4th, I went to Nashville to Covenant Presbyterian Church, and two professors from Westminster, one David Garner, the other David Filson, presented Christ, Culture, and Critical Theory. It was 6 hours, and I think if people search that, I think it's in its entirety is on YouTube now, and it interfaces so beautifully with what you've just told us. And the last piece is Carl Truman attends the OPC church in Grove City, just across from the college. But that was the church that Francis Schaeffer started in 1937.
I did not know that.
1940. And Carl's a regular guy. They breed bulldogs on the side, and just a great guy.
So good. Yeah, and that mortification of spin, he does that with a PCA pastor out of Virginia. So, thank you all for interacting. I appreciate it.